Nymphing is the most effective way to catch fish on a fly rod. Whether you're chasing trout, bass, or even panfish, knowing how to effectively fish with nymphs will put a ton more fish in your net. About 80% of a fish's diet consists of nymphs, so if you don't focus on improving these skills, you're leaving a lot of fish on the table. But what are the skills and techniques that you actually need to focus on? I mean, there's more ways to fish with nymphs than there are people who think Pepsi tastes good. Once you have a grasp of the basics, there are 4 things in particular you can do to take your nymphing to the next level. On today's episode of Untangled, we'll go over these advanced tactics and help you level up with nymphing. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I am your host, Spencer Durant. I've got 4 techniques today that I'm going to lay out that will help you succeed with fishing with nymphs. And this episode, it's really a part 2 or a companion to episode 47. That was one of the first podcasts that I think Alex and I did together where we sat down and actually were in the same room with each other. I'll link that in the show notes if you haven't listened to it or if it's been a minute. But in that episode, we laid out the groundwork for learning how to fish with nymphs. We got into the nitty gritty of setting your rig up, of the basics, of giving you guys foundational knowledge so that you can go out there and be successful with a nymph rig. But it's the time of year now where we're all turning back to nymphing because most of the hatches are just about winding down. You might get some nice little blue wing action if you're lucky. I actually got into a little blue wing hatch yesterday, as a matter of fact, but I still caught everything on nymphs. So it's just that time of year. And I reckon it'd be really good to come back, revisit the nymphing topic, and build on those foundational skills that we discussed in episode 47. So the stuff we're going to talk about today, we're going to assume that you've got that foundational knowledge, and this is going to help you take your nymphing game to the next level. This is that next step in, okay, I understand about getting a good drift, and I feel good about setting my rig up. Now how do I really take that next step and become good at nymphing? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to quit talking about that. Just get right into it. We've got 4 things, like I mentioned. And the first one that we're going to talk about is, I don't know, it might be the hardest, honestly, out of all these skills, but it's learning to watch everything that's going on, learning to watch the fish and not just your bobber. So something that's going to surprise, it might surprise you. I don't know if it will. But when you're fishing with an indicator nymphing rig, you will not see every single take. You'll see a lot of them, but you won't see every one because fish can eat your fly and spit it out without moving your indicator at all. I've got a good buddy of mine. He's a guide, and he guides on this river that is crystal clear, and it's nice because you can see all the fish, but it's also very frustrating because you can see all the fish not eating your flies. It's a very humbling place to go fish at times. But the first few times that he and I fished together, he would tell me to set. I was throwing an nymph rig and he'd say, "Oh, set." And I wouldn't because the bobber didn't move. And I looked at him like he was an idiot. Yeah. I'm looking at the guide who knows his river like, dude, you don't know what you're talking about. I had some arrogant issues back in the day. I hope I've overcome some of those. But my buddy was watching the fish. He wasn't just watching the bobber. He's watching everything that was going on. He saw the fish flash on my flies, and I missed a ton of fish, probably missed some real big ones because I just didn't listen to him. Now, I know it's not possible in every situation to watch your nymphs because you can't always see them. They might be too deep or the water's not crystal clear. There's a whole lot going on. And you can't always see the fish either. But when you're in a river that's low and clear enough to let you see the fish and your flies, then developing this skill of watching everything and not just your bobber, it's going to help you out a ton. Now, what you're looking for in particular is a movement from the fish. So this is often called a flash, this little movement they make. Trout in particular, other fish will do this too, but they're sitting in the current, they're moving side to side, They're opening their mouth to eat nymphs. Now, when their mouth opens, you're going to see the white of the inside of their mouth. That's going to stand out pretty starkly against the background of the river. And that's the dead giveaway that the fish just ate. Some folks call this the white wink. I've heard it referred to as that. I've just always called it a flash. But if you've ever heard that phrase, the white wink, that's what we're talking about here. So if you see that flash and your indicator is right above the fish or it's nearby and you see that flash, you should set the hook because chances are that it just ate your nymph. Now, again, if your indicator's in that area or if you can actually see your flies, I know that especially when they're small, you're probably not going to be able to see them. But if you can see them or you have a really good idea of where they should be and you see a flash, set the hook. That's part of learning more about fish movement and understanding that your bobber's not going to transmit every strike, and you've got to look at the whole picture if you want to catch as many as you can. Now, sometimes you're not going to see their mouth open. You'll only see their side or their belly as they flash to move to eat your nymph. When the fish moves, sometimes that movement will catch the sunlight and they'll shine a little bit, and that's what that flash is. That's where that term comes from. But again, if you see that flash, if your indicator is close enough to where you saw that flash happen, set the hook. Even if your bobber didn't move, you've got to set the hook. I can't tell you how many times this summer I'm out fishing with a dry dropper rig, and that, in theory, is a lot more sensitive than a bobber rig because I can't tell you how many times just this summer I'm out fishing dry dropper rig on my favorite cutthroat stream. And a dry dropper rig should be a lot more sensitive than a bobber rig because the dry fly is going to move easier than the bobber. It's a lighter rig, so you're going to see more of the takes that happen than you will if you're fishing with a bobber. And I would fish this dry dropper rig, and I probably count. Well, I said I couldn't count, but it happened a lot where I'm fishing the water, it's low and clear, and I can see the fish flash. My dry fly never moves, but I can see the fish flash, and I'd set the hook. And more often than not, I think probably almost every time I would see the fish flash and my dry fly was nearby, I would set the hook and boom, that fish had just eaten my nymph. Okay. The dry fly never moved, but I set the hook anyways, and I caught fish. Learning to watch the fish and your bobber together, learning to watch it all as it's coming towards you is going to show you more opportunities to set the hook, and it's going to give you a lot more chances to put fish in the net. So our second point to focus on is all about your rigs, and specifically tweaking your rig until you find a setup that you actually like. Now, there are more nymphing rigs than there are sauces at B-Dubs, and granted, B-Dubs sauce, their wing sauce just is not good, but hopefully you get the point. They've got a lot of it, but they're all subpar. But anyways, you've got drop shot rigs, you've got bounce rigs, you got tag rigs, you got tandem rigs, and honestly, there's not one of them that is dramatically better than the others, in my opinion. It comes down to preference a lot more than anything else. The only nymph rig that I will say is objectively better than anything else is a Euro or a tightline rig, because you do see more takes, you do feel more takes, you get a lot more feedback with that rig, and that's going to translate to more opportunities for hooking up with fish. But those rigs have their limitations as well. And for those who aren't crystal clear on the difference between an indicator rig or a tightline rig, when you throw an indicator or a bobber, as I call them out there, that indicator is keeping your flies at a certain depth, and then it's also telling you when fish eat those flies. And you lose a little bit of sensitivity, but you can cast that rig very far. You've got a lot of versatility with that rig. With the Euro or tightline rigs, you sacrifice the distance. You can't fish those near as far, but you can see and feel almost everything that's going on. So there's trade-offs there, and there's going to be a trade-off no matter what rig you decide to use. I still fish a tandem nymphing rig where I will tie my nymphs off the bend of the hook of the fly that's above them. Here in Wyoming, I can fish 3 flies, so I'll be fishing 3 nymphs. And I like this rig because it casts well. It's an easy rig to cast, even for beginners, I think. It doesn't tangle too much, and it's just what I've always done. That's how I learned to nymph. That's where all of my nymphing experience came from, was with this rig, and I've never really felt the need to change it. I've done a fair amount of Euro nymphing in my day, and I enjoy it. And in fact, I'm starting to do more of it lately, just because I see so many more use cases for it now than I did a few years ago. But anyways, when I'm out there just nymphing with my regular rod and regular setup, I just throw on a tandem nymph rig. It works for me. I've decided that the trade-offs that I get with that rig are worth it. Okay. Now, Alex, on the other hand, he fishes a tag end rig where he ties his flies on tags of tippet that branch off from his leader. So they're going to drift independently of each other. That rig is substantially more sensitive than mine, but it tangles a lot more, and uh, it's probably not as easy to cast. I wouldn't say Alex really has to work to cast it, but you really cannot get tailing loops with that cast. Otherwise, you're going to be in a world of hurt handling those wind knots. And Alex, even, he used to fish this tag rig all the time. That's all he would ever do. But lately, if he's in pocket water, for example, he won't fish it that way because it's too hard to get all the flies in the same spot. Those tags make him want to drift everywhere, and that doesn't always work in pocket water. Or if he's hitting stuff that's got smaller seams or just a smaller, less uniform current in general, he probably won't go with that rig. That's his go-to, where he's got wider seams with a lot more consistent currents. So just between the two of us, right, we've got differences in our rigs. That tandem rig I mentioned, it's a lot easier to cast. However, I do sacrifice some sensitivity. Okay. A drop shot rig, I mentioned that rig a minute ago. That's going to get your flies down deep really quick, more effectively than any other rig, but it's not as sensitive because you've got so much weight at the bottom of it, and it's just a pain to cast, in my opinion. They're really tough to cast. So again, there will be a trade-off with every rig that you pick. Your job is to look at the pros and cons of each of those rigs and then match that to what you want out of your nymphing rig. Again, for me, I want my flies to sink quickly. I want a simple setup, and I want something to cast easy. You might notice a theme here. I like to keep things simple and easy on myself as much as I can. And the tandem rig fits that bill the best for me. And I'm able to catch enough fish with that rig that I feel like I'm successful. And that should be your goal as well. You want to feel like you're successful. If you feel like you're leaving stuff on the table, if you feel like you're not catching as many fish or the big fish or fish where you think you should with a rig, then change it. Go to a different rig, but find something you like and dial in with that rig. Get comfortable with it, understand it, know how you can set it up. And that'll be really important coming up here in just a sec. But find a rig that you like that matches the fishing you're doing, the rivers you're fishing. And yes, you're going to have some kind of trade-off, but when you do this, you're going to get comfortable with this rig. You're going to understand it, and you're going to be that much more effective with that rig moving forward. Our third thing to focus on dovetails very nicely with what we just got done talking about, because you've picked your rig and you're feeling comfortable with it. But just because you have a rig that you like doesn't mean that you're going to set that up the exact same every single time you get out on the water. And once you set it up, it doesn't mean that you won't need to mess with it or adjust it or make changes to it as you go throughout the day. You've got to always be adjusting, or ABA, a little acronyms for us today. You've always got to be adjusting your rig, and primarily you're going to be adjusting the depth and the fly selection. I'll get into that in just a second. But one thing that Alex is much better at than I am with nymphing is adjusting his rig. He will make micro adjustments and go through his progressions. He'll change the depth by a half an inch at a time if he needs to figure out where the fish are, and then he'll change that from hole to hole to hole. He's very good at making those little adjustments. I just tend to fish with brute force and accept that the fish either will or won't eat my flies. That's not, I wouldn't recommend doing it that way. We'll put it that way, because It really just comes from being lazy and not wanting to change things up. But I've got to change that. That's something that personally I have to be better at when I'm out fishing. I've got to be more willing to change instead of just trying to force the fish to do what I want them to do. But the adjustments that you're going to make, I tell you, okay, always be adjusting. Well, that's good, Durant, but what exactly should I be adjusting? Well, I'm glad you asked. Okay. In order of importance, what you should adjust is going to be your depth, the weight that you're using, whether that's flies or split shot, and then fly selection. Okay. So for your depth, you want to be right above the bottom of the river, unless, of course, the fish are higher in the water column. They're eating emergers as they're getting ready to go up and hatch. But most of the time, your nymphs need to be deep enough. And you don't catch fish on your nymph rigs because you have the wrong fly on. Usually when you're struggling to catch fish on nymphs, it's not because you don't have the right fly. It's because you're not deep enough. Okay. That depth is key. Sometimes they'll get picky. Sometimes they will, and they'll want a certain nymph, but that's very rare in my experience. It's almost always a depth issue that's going to prevent you from catching fish. Okay. If you know you're deep enough, which you'll know you're deep enough because you can feel your rig ticking along the bottom. You can feel the flies bouncing along the bottom, or you're snagging the bottom every 5-6 casts or so. If you're snagging every single cast, you're probably a little too deep. You want to move your bobber down about an inch or so to get those flies just a little bit above it. But again, you're ticking the bottom, you're snagging every 5 or 6 casts or so. If you know you're deep enough and the fish aren't cooperating, then you don't need to worry about your depth at that point, but you do need to worry about how you're achieving that depth. Because this is something that I've learned from the tightline anglers, and they're 100% on the right track here. They don't use split shot. And I don't use split shot in my rigs unless I absolutely have to, because when you add too much split shot to your rigs, you are losing sensitivity with every little piece of split shot you put on there. Because in order for that strike to transmit from the fly up through your leader to your bobber and then to you and to set that hook, the fish really have to move it. They've got to move more weight when they take the fly. And that weight, when they go to eat it and they feel this big old chunk of lead pulling them back, that's a dead giveaway that it's fake. And they can spit that out. And that what we talked about at the beginning of the show, they can eat it and spit it out a lot quicker without you noticing if you've got a bunch of split shot on there versus if you don't. Okay. So if you're achieving your depth with a lot of split shot, what I would do if you know your depth is right, but you're not feeling or seeing any takes at all, then I would swap out one of your bottom flies for a much heavier fly and use that fly as the weight, because the way that sits in the rig, instead of it being on the line, that fly is still going to be a bit more sensitive. Okay. It's going to get down, but you gain sensitivity when you remove split shot and use a heavy fly instead. And that's what the tight line and Euro anglers do. They've got the one big heavy fly in the bottom, and then they've got 1 or 2 flies above that on tags. And that's how they achieve their depth. That and some casting techniques and whatnot. But adding that bigger fly will help you, again, with the sensitivity of your rig. And then on top of that, make sure that you're using, I like to use the smallest indicator possible, because the smaller your bobber, the more sensitive it's going to be. You still want it to float on top. You don't want to use a tiny one and you've got a giant stonefly nymph underneath. That's just going to be a disaster because your bobber is going to be sinking all the time and you're not going to have any real feedback or whatnot. But you do want to use the smallest one as possible because they are more sensitive. So I like to opt for the smaller ones. Now, let's say that you've got your depth good and you know your rig's as sensitive as you can make it. That's when you want to look at switching up your flies. That's when it's time to say, okay, maybe they really are picky today. They want a certain kind of a bug because, and of course, this is assuming that you are drifting your flies in the right spot. You don't have any drag and your presentation is spot on. If all those things are good, you're still not catching fish, then it's time to change flies. What I'll usually do is I will default the stuff that's as close to a guarantee as it's possible to get. So stuff like scuds, midges, sow bugs, or worms. if I'm fishing, let's say I got a hare's ear and a big stonefly nymph on, I'm fishing that stuff, and the fish just aren't moving on those, that's when I'll switch to those midges, scuds, sow bugs, worms, the stuff that's tried and true, that those bugs are going to be there. The fish are going to eat them. That's what I would switch to. Until you start catching fish, until you consistently start getting into fish, always be adjusting your rig. ABA that stuff as much as possible. If you fish through something that looks phenomenal, water that just screams, hey, there's a fish here, buddy, and you don't get anything, that's when I would start to make changes. If you fish it really well, your presentation was solid, but you still don't get anything, that's when I would start making changes. There is no time limit. There's no set schedule to follow when you should make adjustments to your rigs. That's a question we get a lot. Folks will say, well, how long should I fish before I change? Well, it depends. That's a judgment call you had to make. Were you fishing kind of half-heartedly and maybe got some good drifts? Or were you dialed in and got fantastic drifts and the fish still refused it? Okay, if it's the latter, then yeah, it probably is time to start changing your flies out. Okay, one hole without catching a fish, you go through one hole without catching a fish, that's a regular anomaly. Okay, but if you're going through multiple pieces of water that look great and you feel really good about your presentation, then that's probably an indicator that your rig needs some adjusting. And that leads us right into our fourth point here, which is you got to set that hook like you mean it. This is something that I see tons of anglers, especially beginners, struggle with their hook sets. And shoot, even some anglers who should know better are struggling with their hook sets. And I am as guilty as anybody else of having bad hook sets. I will not pretend that I am not. It's just the other day, I lost a really nice fish. Me and Alex were out. I lost a really, really nice fish because I didn't set the hook well enough. But when you set that hook, you've got to set it like you mean it. Set it with some purpose. Okay, when we talk about casting and we talk about how to achieve a good cast, I always tell folks to move the rod with purpose. You don't just sit there and limp wrist the rod around, right? You move your fly rod with purpose. You accelerate smoothly. You come to an abrupt stop. Okay, those are the purposeful moves you're making with your fly rod. Your hook set should be the same thing. Set it with purpose. Don't just move it. Set it like you're actually trying to do something. Okay? Let me give you an example. A few years ago, this was right after I met the VFC crew. I took Alex and his brother Berkeley out for a float on one of my favorite rivers. We were real excited to get out fishing. I think this was Berkeley's second or third time out of a drift boat. So he was really excited for that. And I'm on the oars and Berkeley's out in front of me and I've got him lined up. His indicator's drifting through this beautiful run and his indicator shoots under. And based on where we were on the river and how his indicator moved, I was like, ooh, that's a big fish. But again, this is Berkeley's second or third time in a drift boat. And he just kind of lazily set the hook. He didn't really set it with much authority. And I was hollering at him, set it, set it, set it. And he just kind of lazily set it. And then this fish jumps. It's huge, this giant old rainbow, just flies out of the water, spits the hook, swims off. And I'm just sitting there just hollering something fierce at Berkeley. Just, why didn't you set the hook? You screwed it up. I can't believe that. That was a huge fish. What are you doing? And poor Berkeley feels terrible. And I'm just chewing him out, which honestly, most of it was my fault because I was on the oars. I should have reminded him, hey, make sure you set the hook hard. And I didn't. But the nice thing about this is, as big of a jerk as I was, Berkeley set the hook very well for the rest of the day. And he caught a few more pretty nice fish for the rest of the float. So he learned that lesson, even though I was a complete jerk about how I taught it to him. Okay. When your bobber moves or you see the fish flash, set the hook, set it with purpose. And a technique that will help you is set the hook downstream in the direction that the current's moving. That way, you've got the weight of the current to help drive the hook point home. It'll help you get a better hook set. Your hook set needs to be firm and quick, and you should apply enough pressure when you do it that your fly rod bends. If your fly rod doesn't bend at all, you probably did not set the hook hard enough. You also want to make sure that your fly line is tight and that there's as little slack between you and your flies as possible. I like to pinch my fly line between my finger and the cork to make sure that the fly line does not move when I set the hook, because if you go to set the hook and your fly line is not tight and there's movement, especially if it's out ahead of your hands, if it's through the guides and whatnot, and the line's just kind of moving as it goes, you're not going to get a good hook set. You want a nice, tight connection and a nice, tight hook set. Okay. The more you fish, the more you're going to learn what a good and bad hook set feels like. So this is something you've really just got to get the reps in with. But the rule of thumb, again, set like you mean it. You don't got to go all Bassmaster Classic on us. You don't have to set with your whole body, okay? But set with some authority and some force. Show that fish who's boss, okay? You're the angler. Act like it. You're the angler, act like it, okay? Awesome. Well, folks, if you can implement these 4 tips into your nymphing, I promise you're going to see a big uptick in how many fish you catch. You really, these 4 things really will help you take that next step. I know they're more complex and they're going to take some time and they're going to take some reps, but putting the time in will be worth it. I promise. All right, folks. Well, with that, don't go anywhere because we've got the Q&A section of the show coming right up.
One of the most frequently asked questions we get from both beginners and experienced anglers is, what fly should I use? With the thousands of fly patterns that exist, it can be completely overwhelming. That's why we've put together an entire ebook that walks you through everything about bugs and picking the right fly, no matter where you're fishing. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this ebook for free. All right, back to the show.
Every week, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers, and often the questions y'all submit will become the basis for the open of the show as well. So if you've got a question that you would like answered, send those on in. There's a link to do that in the show notes. And our first question this week comes to us from Josh from North Carolina, writes in and says, I am somewhat new to fly fishing and love the show. Was curious on your thoughts on the popular TFO NXT Black Label in 9-foot 5 weight, and if an outfit such as this would be good for covering small stream fishing. Thanks in advance. Well, Josh, thanks for sending that question in. I appreciate it. TFO makes great rods. I've reviewed 4 or 5 of them. I think. For those who don't know, I reviewed fly rods for the last 10 years now. I'm getting old. But I've been doing rod reviews for a while. I still do rod reviews for a few different magazines. So I've had the opportunity to fish quite a few different ones. And with that said, if you're going to buy a 9-foot 5 weight, and you're looking at rods like the TFO, you're looking at rods in that price point, we've got a real fantastic one here at VFC. Our Fly Flinger, it's a great stick. Alex uses it all the time. Fly Flinger for life is what he always tells me. I'll be testing or reviewing some new rods and whatnot, and I'll try to get Alex to fish them. And I'll be like, dude, try this rod, you'll like it. He's like, no, Fly Flinger for life. And he just goes off and fishes it. And he does it because he actually loves it. It's a good little stick. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a better value for your dollar than what we offer with the Fly Flinger. I'll throw a link to that in the show notes for those who want to take a look at it. And just building on this a little bit more, your 9-foot 5 weight, it's a versatile do-it-all rod. So that's going to handle small stream fishing. You can always go with shorter or lighter rods if you want to, but especially, Josh, you said you're somewhat new to fly fishing. I caution new anglers against buying the 7-foot 3 weight or the 8-foot 4 weight for the small stream stuff, because when you're so new, you honestly don't have the skills and the experience to appreciate what those smaller rods do and how they're going to work. And I don't know that you always have the skills to coax the best performance out of them. I think for a beginner, it is a much better learning curve to start with the 9-foot 5 weight, get familiar with it, understand it, know how to cast, have a good grasp of casting mechanics before you decide to branch off and specialize in other rods. I'm not telling you not to go buy other rods. I own over 40 fly rods. It's a real problem. And It's a whole issue. But I didn't start branching off into the smaller rods for a good while after I started fly fishing. I obviously have now, but I'm not trying to sound like I'm gatekeeping either. I'm trying to be wary of that because I don't want to tell somebody how to fly fish. Like, oh, well, you have to do it this way because that's how we've always done it. I'm just saying that 9-foot 5-weight's going to help you out a ton. So it's going to handle the small stream stuff. It's going to handle the bigger stream stuff. It'll handle trout. It'll handle smaller bass. It'll handle panfish. It's just a good all around rod. And it's hard for me to want to tell a beginner, oh yeah, go get this other one as well. And there's a lot more that goes into picking a fly rod. We actually put together a video on how to pick a fly rod. It's geared specifically toward beginners. I'll put that link in the show notes as well for anybody who's got any more fly rod related questions. Louis from New Zealand has our next question, writes in and says, hey, Spencer, been watching the podcast a lot and love listening to them. I just had a question about flies. I get a little bit worried when I use a pink bead with bright purple dubbing and flip over rocks and all the bugs are brown. How do trout react to these flashy colors? Thanks, and Coke all the way. Well, Louis, this is a really good question. Thank you for sending that in. Appreciate that you watch the show as well. Thank you. Fish see incredibly well. They've got just phenomenal eyesight, but their eyesight is particularly adapted to identifying contrasting colors. That's what their eyesight helps them focus in on. I actually dug into this topic way back in episode 9, 90 episodes ago on this podcast. And I'm not going to link to that one because those early episodes were so rough from a production quality standpoint. If you've listened to all of them, if you've been with us since the beginning, thank you so much. I don't know why anybody stayed with us at the beginning because, those were bad. Hopefully the production quality is better now. But anyways, I found some research published by Dr. Keith Jones in this article in Fly Fisherman Magazine. I'll link that article for y'all. But the gist of Dr. Jones's research is that size, shape, and movement are the primary triggers for trout and bass to eat. Color is a distant fourth. It is incredibly low on the list of what the fish, trout, and bass, the list that they use to decide whether they're going to eat something or not. They just don't care for it. It's the last thing on their mind. And yes, some fish will get educated and they'll learn to tell the difference between colors, but that applies most often when you're fishing with dry flies. When you're fishing with nymphs, color just, it is very low on the list of things a fish cares about. Color actually loses a lot of its vibrancy at depth in the water. So what you're looking for is actually some ways to get your flies to stand out. And the best way to accomplish that is going to be with contrast. So adding hot spots to your flies. It's a very popular trend right now, and for good reason, because that contrast helps the fish see your fly. The contrast will get their attention, and then they look at the fly and they say, oh, that's the right size, shape, it's got the right movement to it. I'm going to eat it. I don't care that it's fuchsia or whatever color you've used. That might help get their attention, but that's not what's sealing the deal. It's the size, the shape, and the movement of the fly that seal the deal for you. So the fact that you're using flies that don't match in color, but they match in their size and shape, that's fine, especially if you're catching fish on them. I wouldn't worry about that at all. If you're catching fish, man, you're doing everything right at that point. The contrast, like I said, I think it might even make them more effective than flies tied with traditional colors or even some of our traditional patterns. That said, though, it is possible to have contrast with classic materials too. I mean, let's take a look at the Prince Nymph, for example. It's got a dark body, but it's got a little bit of hackle and then some green and white goose biots that form the tail and the wing case and the legs. So it's got this dark body, lighter colored legs, and then a bead head. There's a good mix of natural but contrasting colors in there. It's not just one uniform kind of blah thing. Now, I say this, and then we have flies like the Waltz worm that is just all uniform, and those work exceptionally well. So, yes, there are trade-offs sometimes. There are exceptions that prove the rule, but by and large, that contrast is going to do well for you. Now, just to add a final point here, my favorite tailwater here by my place, it is renowned for the amount of crawdads that are swimming around in it. And the fish love to eat any nymph that looks like a crawdad. So the fly shops, they're selling tons of different colors of these things. But I always fish the ones that have a natural colored tail and then an orange body, because I know I'm going to be fishing these crawdad nymphs deep. And I like the contrast of those colors. I think they stand out very well at depth. But I've also heard guys in the fly shops talking that, oh, well, you've got to use the green ones this week, or it's got to be natural this week. But I fish the same color combo year round, and I do just fine. I catch as many fish. I'm as successful on that river as anybody else I know who regularly hits it. And that's not to brag or anything. That's just to say, hey, I don't necessarily change my fly colors like everybody says to, and I still catch plenty of fish. Okay. The point being that color does not matter very much at all. It's the contrast that plays a huge role for whether the fish are going to look at the fly and see it and then decide, yep, size, shape, movement, they're all perfect, and go gobble it up. So thanks a bunch for sending that question in. I appreciate it. Steve from New Mexico has our next question, writes in and says, I'm new to fishing, live 15 miles north of Taos, New Mexico. I bought a St. Croix Premier rod 7.5 with a static FM 2500 reel. I watch your YouTube content and would like recommendations for flies for the Rio Grande trout near Taos. Well, Steve, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. I spent a lot of time thinking about how to answer this question. And what I want to do is I'm going to answer this question as if this is what I would do if I was in your situation. If I was new to fly fishing and I wanted to get out and start getting into some fish. My goal when I was a new angler is I wanted to be self-sufficient. What I mean by that is I wanted to be able to go out on the river, see what's going on, and catch fish. Just like my buddies who could just go out there and catch fish, but I wanted to be able to do it without them. I wanted to be able to go out there, catch fish, and not have anybody holding my hand or helping me through it. I wanted to be able to do that on my own. I wanted to be self-sufficient. So to start with that, you're going to need some gear before you can go out there and do it. Steve, you've got a rod and a reel you mentioned, but you're going to need a little bit more than that. So that's why we've got our starter packs here at VFC. They've got everything you need for fly fishing. I'll throw a link to those in the show notes if anybody wants to check them out. But once you've got your gear, then you need to start building this foundation of knowledge about fly fishing. Because if I just gave you a list of the flies to use and said, here you go, it's not going to mean very much to you because you're not going to understand why those flies work. And you don't become self-sufficient unless you understand the why behind everything we do. That's why fly fishing is so daunting to a lot of folks and why it takes so long for some people to become adept at it and to become proficient at it, because there is so much to understand. There are so many whys to understand. And that's also why my friend Dom Swintoski over at Troutbit, and he says there are no experts in fly fishing. And I tend to agree with him because I don't think everybody or anybody understands every single why in fly fishing. And I think to be an expert, you'd have to understand every single why. We understand a lot of them, and we've got a really good idea, but we don't know everything about it. Okay? I got off into the weeds a little bit there. I'm sorry, but understanding the why behind things, that is the key to becoming a great angler and understanding as much as you possibly can. So to build that foundation of knowledge, to start learning about the why behind things, we've got our beginner masterclass, and then we've also got a fly selection masterclass that we've started. I'll link those in the show notes as well. That's going to give you a great base of knowledge. You want to learn how to fly fish, those two masterclasses are going to just, they're going to do it for you. They're going to level you up super quick. Once you've got that foundational knowledge base, then you've got a ton of wonderful resources that are just right there. I know there's tons of great fly shops in Taos. There's tons of great fly fishing down there, so there's going to be good fly shops. Once you've got this foundational knowledge, you can go into those shops and you can talk to folks, you can get some help. You're going to know what questions to ask, and because you've got some knowledge, you're going to feel like you can actually have a conversation instead of just being told what to do. And then when you get this information, when you get these recommendations from the fly shops or whatnot, you're going to understand the why behind it. That's going to sink in. That's going to stay with you. You're going to learn something from that, and you're going to be a better angler because of it. The best way to progress and learn as an angler is to put yourself in those situations to learn. And if you're just told what flies to use, you're just handed a list, instead of observing the bugs that are active and applying that information to pick a bug on your own, you're going to have a much harder time becoming a self-sufficient angler. And that's our goal. That's what we want to do at VFC, is help you become a self-sufficient angler. So the only thing you need from us is more flies or whatever it is, right? But that's our goal. That's why we do all this content. We want you to be able to go out there, live real life, and just have a fantastic time on the water without the frustrations, without feeling like you don't understand what's going on. So the whole reason we do these masterclass, the whole reason I do the podcast every week, is to help everybody learn what's going on and to understand it. Because once you understand it, then things start to click. And that's when you make that leap from just maybe every now and then catching a fish to consistently catching them. That's what takes you from frustrated beginner who's caught a couple but doesn't know why to successful angler who can go out on any river and feel confident they're going to catch a fish. Okay, doing these little things, taking the time to do it the right way and to learn the right way is going to pay off immensely in the end, I promise. And with that, folks, that is the end of the Q&A section this week, but it is not the end of the show. We've got the Live Real Life moment coming right up. Every week, we end the show by sharing a story from one of our viewers or listeners. We love to hear about your time on the water while you're out there living real life. I want to hear your stories, want to see them. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment to submit, there's a link to submit that in the show notes. You can send a picture in. You can send a video in even. We'll play it. And Kent, he sent in this week's Live Real Life moment, which is as follows. It was my first time steelhead fishing. I was doing a half-day float trip. Landed this one in the first 30 minutes. It being a native steelhead, it was a quick pick and back into the water. Unfortunately, no more steelhead for the rest of the day, but I'm hooked. This is something I'm looking to do more of this fall. What a beautiful and powerful fish. Kent, that's first time steelheading, and you get one in the first 30 minutes. That's pretty incredible. I'll tip my hat to you. Good work. Good job being out there and being ready to do it. Steelhead are fun, aren't they? I've caught a couple. I'm trying to remember now. At least one, maybe a couple more. They're a lot of fun. They're a lot of fun fish. But thanks for sending that Live Real Life moment in, Kent. Love hearing from you. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap the show up this week. Thank you so much for being here with us every week and listening. I love that we get to do this, and we couldn't do it without y'all listening to the show every week. So thank you. And if you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to us and rate us wherever you're listening to this show. The more subscriptions and ratings we get, the more reach we have and the more folks we can help live real life and have a fantastic day out there on the water. And with that said, we are rapidly approaching the end of the good fishing season. So get out there on the water, have some fun, and until next week, tie lines.